89.3 The Current, that is The Replacements with Talent Show, and that came from Don't Tell a Soul. Also, two from Hootenanny, You Blues, and Heyday. I am talking to Bob Mehr, who is the author of Trouble Boys, The True Story of the Replacements, and that book is out, and you can purchase it, or you can go see Bob, which I would highly recommend you do, at the Turf Club on Saturday, 4 o'clock, for reading and signing and shenanigans. Now, we've been talking about the book, and, there's a lot discussed about, rivalry in the sense that whether it was super real or acknowledged, or it was just talked about under people's breath. But, Husker Du and the Replacements came up around the same time, and sort of were on the same trajectory in some ways, but then clearly went different ways. And one thing that I've always found talking to people who were there at the time, that the Replacements had an appeal to women. Uh-huh. And I don't think it's just because, of Tom. Well, maybe it was just because of Tommy, but it was like there was something very accessible, I think, to a female audience. And in that hardcore scene, and probably any hardcore scene, it was a little tough if you were wanting to be up front, wanting to be in a pit or something like that. And I don't know if that has much to do with it as well either.
I mean, I certainly think the Huskers' early audience and the kind of crowd that followed them was dude heavy. It was a brodeo, as they say. But and there was probably a little bit more of a broader appeal for the Replacements for a variety of reasons. I mean, even early on when they weren't kind of doing the more, let's say, romantic or sensitive songs, I think they still had a broader appeal. I think, part of it was the novelty of Tommy at that young age, and Paul obviously had a certain charisma, but it was just more of, I think, a show that had a dynamic that appealed to a wider variety of people and more females, I think.
Yeah, and I mean, when anybody who maybe grew up in Minneapolis, it does seem like there was something in the water, and it was sort of like a 10-block radius where it was like everyone was sort of a lapsed Catholic and had like a drunk parent, and and dropped out and then formed a band, and some of them very successful, and there was just something kind of special that was happening. I'm sure you could say that if I grew up in St. Louis or anywhere else, but there is something about Minneapolis that does sort of claim these guys as their own, and it's interesting because they kind of fought against that, I think, a little bit. But you wrote about, their since when they came back on the reunion during the Riot Fest, that there was, like even Tommy said, there was a real appreciation to look out at Midway Stadium and see these people.
Well, and I think the reunion was interesting because even when I started the book as far back as 08, 09, that was always kind of lurking in the background. When the reissues came out, their album reissues came out in 2008, they were talking, the offers were there every year. At one point, they'd even kind of rehearsed a little bit. Mm-hmm. And I think Paul was reluctant to do it in part because he didn't want to tarnish this legacy, this thing that had grown up in their absence. And I think there's a sense of having to compete with your younger self in a way when you go out. And most of that onus was on him. And of course, he's 7, 8 years older than Tommy as it is. So there's I think there was always that. I think when Slim, unfortunately, had his health issues, and they got back together to do the Songs for Slim EP, mm-hmm. I think it kind of gave the whole reunion a little bit more of a noble cause, and a kind of, and I'm sure there was some sense of, between Slim's situation and, of course, Bob passing and Steve Foley passing, a sense of their own mortality. It's like, if we're going to do this, we have to do this at some point. And I think, again, everything boils down to timing ultimately. But for them to come to Midway and see 14,000 people there and go the next week to New York City, and I know there was a lot of trepidation about playing, that was only their second headlining show, playing a big place in New York City. And, New York City audiences can be jaded. And, mm-hmm. I think the experience of that was so phenomenal. I think that kind of the unanimous feeling is like those two shows were just the high points of the reunion. And, when you're standing there and there's 14,000 people singing your songs back to you as, generational anthems, you can't but feel proud. You can't but feel validated, vindicated, and, whatever good about that. So.
Well, when you think of all of the primary players and the secondary and thirdary people that you talked to and interviewed along the way with the book, if you right now had to write a script for a sitcom for any one of them, who would you like to flesh out?
Oh, well, Slim Dunlap is one of the most interesting people I've ever met for a lot of reasons. Mm-hmm. His father was a politician or served in the state senate and from his region up in Wabash County, and he came from a family here in St. Paul of newspapermen, so he came from this real family. But then his father, I think, after the war experience, wanted to move to a small town, and he grew up kind of son of a country lawyer.
Oh yeah.
And at the same time, Slim is such an intellectual guy and so wry and such a character in his own right. I mean, I think, you know, one of my favorite stories in the book is I write about the moment in '88 and they were making Don't Tell a Soul, and they kind of had a little confab with Tom Waits, went out palling around and drinking, and he took it back to the studio and recorded. And Tom Waits was just fascinated by Slim because he thought, man, this is a guy right out of one of my own songs. So, you know, I think Slim's the real deal. So, you know, of anybody who maybe deserves their own story, their sitcom or whatever, I would love to see the Slim story come to life a little bit more.
And I would like to, you know, add that, I mean, each and every one of the characters, I guess they're real people, there is an interesting story. I mean, we could spend the next hour talking about Chris Mars. And one thing I do think that we should touch on is that, you know, I think, and I hope that this is something that you did write and you didn't just tell me off camera, but it's like, I think you had mentioned that
to what they were saying at that moment, because, you know, your answers and your story and your perspective changes over time. So it was about synthesizing all that stuff in a way that made sense, both, you know, past and present, as far as, you know, kind of telling the tale.
You know, one of the producers, and they worked with many different people, including Tommy Ramone, but Jim Dickinson, who's always kind of been a bit of a larger-than-life character for me. When you talked to him, what one story did he tell you that you had never heard before?
Well, you know, I talked to Jim. I knew Jim just from being in Memphis and talked to him about the Replacements for years, sort of informally and then somewhat formally. And I was going to talk to him more formally, but obviously he passed in 2009. But Jim loved to talk, and so there was a lot of other interviews. And, you know, Paul always joked and said the best thing Jim ever did for us was telling all these, like, you know, tall tales about what we did and who we were, and it's kind of created this myth. But, you know, the thing I think that was most interesting about Jim and that record is they went to Memphis almost in a sense to break up. They had split with Bob, split with Peter Jesperson, and at a certain point, Paul had wanted to quit the group rather than fire Bob, and they decided, well, no, we're going to continue on. So they kind of went down to Memphis almost to do a trial session with Dickinson, thinking this isn't going to work, we'll combust theatrically in the studio. And it turned out, because of Jim and some of the really great engineers they have at Arden, that they decided to make a record. And it's the only record they made as a three-piece with Paul handling all the guitars. And I think just being in Memphis, it was the first time they'd worked outside of Minneapolis. It was the first time they had sort of cut a real record. You know, up to then they'd been cutting everything live, and worked in a big-time professional studio. So that is a unique experience. And I think, as Paul put it, and as the story goes, you know, Jim was interested in the psychodynamics of the studio, and so he had a lot of psychodynamics to work with there. and he, you know, he was able to trick, cajole, distract, charm, you know, bribe, whatever he had to do. And Paul said that, you know, Jim would start telling stories about Elvis and Otis Redding and all these famous Memphis people, and would just kind of get them out of their own heads and say, okay, let's cut now.
Right.
You know, and so that's a really great thing about Jim, and why I think that record has the most kind of sustained performance in a sense from the band.
He also had, I thought, some fairly amazing things to say about Tommy.
Yeah. I mean, that was a relationship that went on after the Replacements. Jim ended up producing the Perfect album, which didn't come out for a while, but eventually did, and was always very encouraging of Tommy. Tommy had cut a couple things on his own, but Jim had him cut some stuff in the studio that day, during that session, which hasn't come out. But I think he really sort of elevated Tommy and gave Tommy the confidence, and because he understood sort of Tommy's sense of maybe needing a figure in his life like that. And, you know, they were close up until Jim's death. I mean, Jim was encouraging him from the hospital bed, you know, as he was dying. And Tommy continues to have a relationship with Jim's son, Luther and Cody. In fact, most of the interviews, or a good chunk of them we did down in Memphis, was Tommy was just down there recording and visiting with the Dickinsons. We did that in Memphis there. So, you know, the Dickinson thread for Tommy was very strong and started, you know, on that record.
Bob Mehr, who is the author of Trouble Boys, The True Story of the Replacements, this has been years in the making. It is, like I was saying, you know, I've been reading so many different people's reactions and the joy that it's bringing to people, and there's a sense of, you know, I mean, everybody is sentimental about certain things, but this is pretty raw and pretty true, and I don't know how many people will be shocked by it, but some people will go, yeah, I was there, I remember that, and some people will go, I had no idea. And as a reader, you're a writer, obviously, but as a reader, what to you constitutes a compelling biography?
For me, if it's going to be a band biography, I think in some ways writing about a single artist is different, and that was one of the challenges here because you weren't just trying to tell one person's story, but four people's story or five or six, and the other story was how they related to each other and all that stuff. So it's so layered. There's so many dimensions and dynamics and complexities there. And yeah, I think maybe some people in their reactions to reading it are surprised. There are some dark turns, obviously. There's some difficult stuff. But, there's some triumphant moments, too. And I think in understanding the whole story, you get a better sense of the good, the bad, the light, and the dark. And, people say, and I think people perceive it maybe as, it's this kind of story, that kind of story. There's heroes, villains, there's bad guys. It's none of that stuff. It's life. It's messy and complicated and beautiful. And there's no heroes and villains. There's just human beings, and all their frailties and good qualities and bad qualities are on display. So, I mean, I think that's, if for me, that's what makes a compelling book. And hopefully that I've been able to do that, both in terms of the time and the research and just getting the kind of technical stuff that you have to do to tell a narrative and kind of to write a history, which is almost what it feels like. But, I think it moves pretty briskly, and I was very lucky in that the subject matter is pretty rich
yes,
from start to finish.
It is. I'm certain that you've probably let your mind wander to this place. Mine has. At some point, somebody's going to buy the rights to this and try to make this into a movie. So who are you casting as the young PW and Tommy Stinson?
Well, unfortunately, Don Knotts is no longer with us.
Dang it!
No, everybody keeps saying Jesse Eisenberg,
okay,
which I can sort of see a little bit, although, that's the funny part about, you kind of play these games with people. I haven't had too much time to do, but I've seen people mention that, and it's like, God, who do you get? Because they were so... The replacements in real life were more distinctive, more interesting, more outrageous, more charming than any actor that I can think of, any personality from TV or film. So it's sort of, I think it'll be, if it comes to pass and somebody wants to give a check and you can make that out to me,
right.
Bob Mehr. That's their problem to solve. But, I don't know. It would be, I'll have to sit down and think about that more.
All right. Well, let's say that you who are a fan of The Replacements are, if not already picked up this book, you are going to. It is in all your favorite bookstores, and you're going to go probably to see Bob at the Turf Club for the book release party and book.
Don't make me stay there by myself.
No, it's going to be wall to wall.
It's going to be. We're going to have some interesting playlists, music stuff. We might show some interesting clips. There's going to be some giveaways. Rhino Records, Warner Brothers has generously donated some cool replacement swag because they've got. They put out a vinyl box set of the Twin Tone years, and they've got a vinyl box set of the Sire years coming out at the end of the month. So, all incentives for people to come out to the Turf Club on Saturday.
Perfect. I interviewed Tommy just about a month and a half ago, and I asked him if his life were to take a terrible turn and he found himself robbing liquor stores. If he were to jump in a getaway car, what song would he want blasting out of his getaway car? And this is the song he chose, and I think it's perfect for all of us here. Bob, thank you so much, and we'll see you Saturday.
See you Saturday.
Right on. It is the Faces on the Current.